She stuffed her attic with loose hay, unaware it would save her when the freeze struck. Gunnar Thorvaldsen, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried 2 wives to the cold, told her flatly, "A widow can't cut timber, can't haul coal, can't keep a fire through a 3-day blow. You'll freeze in that shanty, and those girls will freeze with you." She had $14, 2 daughters under 7, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. But 5 months earlier, Anna Lindqvist had never spent a single night alone on the prairie. In August of 1887, Anna buried her husband 3 feet deep in Dakota soil because the ground was too hard to dig any deeper. Eric had been dead 4 days by then, killed by typhoid fever that swept through Turner County that summer and took 11 others with him. The Lutheran minister came from Marion, 8 miles by wagon, and said words Anna barely heard. Her daughters stood beside her in black dresses sewn from the same bolt of cloth she'd bought for curtains. Britta was 6, Maya was 4. Neither understood why their father wouldn't wake up. The mourners left before dark. No one could spare the time to stay longer. Harvest was coming, and the living needed tending. That first night, Anna sat at the table in the 12 by 16-foot shanty Eric had built 4 years earlier and listened to the wind push through gaps in the lumber. The sound was familiar. She'd heard it every night since they'd arrived from Sweden. But Eric had always been there to stuff the gaps with fresh newspaper, to stoke the fire, to tell her the walls would hold. Now the walls were her problem. Everything was her problem. She had $14 in coin hidden beneath a floorboard. She owed $12 to the general store in Parker for seed and salt, and lamp oil bought on credit against a harvest Eric would never bring in. She had 40 acres broken and planted with wheat that needed cutting, threshing, and selling, work she did not know how to do alone. She had a milk cow, 4 chickens, and 2 daughters who needed food through a winter that would last 5 months. And she had no firewood. Eric had always cut the wood. He'd ride the wagon 12 miles to the creek bottoms where cottonwood grew, fell trees with an axe and crosscut saw, split the logs with a maul, stack the cords beside the house. 8 cords minimum for a Dakota winter, he'd told her. 10 if the cold ran long. She had watched him do it every September since 1884. She had never touched the saw. The woodpile beside the shanty held perhaps 2 cords, the remnants of last winter's supply and whatever deadfall Eric had collected before he fell sick. Anna walked out to look at it the morning after the funeral. The logs were stacked loose, gaps showing between them. 2 cords. Maybe less. 2 cords against a need of 8. 3 weeks later, Gunnar Thorvaldsen rode to her claim. Thorvaldsen was 62 years old, Norwegian, the oldest homesteader in Swan Lake Township. He'd arrived in Dakota Territory in 1877, before the railroad, before most towns existed. He'd survived the hard winter of 1880 through 1881, when snow buried houses to their rooftops and entire herds of cattle froze standing up. His first wife had died that winter. His second wife had died 3 years later, pneumonia in the cold. He lived alone now on the adjacent claim, half a mile north. He'd buried more neighbors than anyone in the county. Thorvaldsen dismounted and studied Anna's woodpile for a long moment. Then he walked the perimeter of her shanty, pressing his hand against the tar paper, peering at the gaps between the dried lumber boards where newspaper stuffing showed yellow and brittle. Anna came out to meet him. Britta and Maya stayed inside, watching through the window. Thorvaldsen didn't waste words on sympathy. He'd said those at the funeral. Now he spoke in numbers. 8 cords minimum, he said. 10 if the winter runs long. Anna nodded. She knew this. A woman alone can't swing a splitting maul 8 hours a day and 10 children. He gestured at the shanty. That lumber bleeds heat. Sod walls keep warmth. Lumber lets it run out. You'll burn twice what a soddy would need." "I know," Anna said. Thorvaldsen looked at her woodpile again. His face didn't change, but Anna saw something in his eyes, not cruelty, not contempt, just the flat arithmetic of a man who had counted the dead. "You should sell the claim," he said. "Take those girls back to your people in Sweden before the ground freezes. There's no shame in it. Better to leave than—" He stopped. "Then what?" Thorvaldsen met her gaze. "A widow can't cut timber, can't haul coal, can't keep a fire through a 3-day blow. You'll freeze in that shanty, and those girls will freeze with you." He mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for a reply. There was nothing Anna could say that would change the math he'd described. She watched him until he disappeared over the low rise toward his claim. Then she went inside and looked at her daughters, who had heard everything through the thin walls. "Mama," Britta said, "are we going to freeze?" Anna didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. That night she lay awake and counted the weeks until winter. 14, perhaps? November would bring the first hard cold. January and February would bring the worst. She needed 8 cords of firewood and had 2. She needed $18 to buy coal from Marion, $6 per ton, 3 tons minimum, and had 14, 12 of which she already owed. Every calculation ended the same way, but she also had nowhere to go. Passage back to Sweden cost more than she possessed. Her family in Småland had written her off when she married Eric and left. She had no relatives in America, no friends with room to spare, no skills that would earn money in a town. If she sold the claim, Elmer Dahl, the American who owned the land to the east, had already offered $40. $40 for 160 acres. It was theft dressed as charity, and even theft wouldn't buy her passage home. Anna had no answer for Thorvaldsen's arithmetic, but she also had no choice. The first solution Anna tried was the obvious one. She borrowed Eric's cross-cut saw and dragged it to the nearest stand of cottonwood, 3 miles southeast along a dry creek bed. The saw was 5 feet long, designed for 2 people, one on each end pulling in rhythm. She tried to use it alone. Within an hour, her shoulders burned. Within 2 hours, she had cut through less than half the trunk of a single tree. The saw kept binding, the teeth catching in the green wood, and she didn't know how to set them properly. By the 3rd hour, she had finished 1 cut and faced the realization that the tree would require dozens more before she could haul anything usable. 1 tree, 1 day, 1 cut. At that pace, she could produce maybe a 1/4 cord per week if she abandoned the cow, the chickens, the garden, the children, and worked sunrise to sunset every day. 8 cords would take 32 weeks. Winter would arrive in 14. She dragged the saw home and didn't try again. The second solution was coal. Anna hitched the wagon and rode to Marion to ask about prices. $6 per ton for soft coal, delivered from the railroad depot. $12 for anthracite, which burned longer and hotter. 3 tons of soft coal would cost $18. She had 14, minus the 12 she owed. She had $2 to spend and a need for 18. She walked out of the general store without buying anything except lamp oil. As she climbed onto the wagon, she noticed Elmer Dahl watching her from across the street. He tipped his hat and smiled. She didn't wave back. The third solution was charity. In late September, Anna swallowed her pride and visited Ingrid Halvorsen, a Norwegian woman 3 miles west who had been kind to her at church. Ingrid and her husband Olaf had a proper sod house and 4 children, and barely enough for themselves. But Anna hoped. "I can't spare firewood," Ingrid said before Anna could finish asking. "We need every stick. But you could come stay with us, you and the girls. We'd be crowded, but you'd be warm." Anna thanked her and said she'd think about it. But staying with the Halvorsens meant abandoning the claim. If she left the homestead for more than 6 months, she'd forfeit her right to the land under the Homestead Act. She'd lose the one thing Eric had given his life to build. Everything they'd worked for since 1882 would disappear. She rode home alone. October arrived. The temperature dropped into the 20s at night. Anna woke every 2 hours to feed the stove and watched her woodpile shrink. The newspaper stuffed into the wall cracks grew brittle and tore. Wind whistled through gaps she couldn't see, carrying warmth out of the house as fast as the stove could make it. At this rate, she'd burn through her 2 cords by Thanksgiving. Christmas would find her with nothing left but hay twists and furniture. Anna had run out of obvious solutions, but she hadn't yet found the one that would save her life. In late October, Anna rode to the Knutzen homestead to trade eggs for flour. The Knutzens were German Russians, immigrants who had farmed the Ukrainian steppes for 3 generations before coming to Dakota Territory. They knew cold the way Anna knew the forests of Sweden, as a constant, familiar enemy. Their sod house sat low against the prairie, walls 2 feet thick, roof covered with earth and grass. Anna stepped inside and noticed immediately that it was warmer than her shanty, despite the smaller fire burning in the stove. "How do you keep it so warm?" Anna asked. Mrs. Knutzen laughed. "The earth holds the heat. Lumber lets it escape. Your frame house." She shook her head. "The warmth goes up through the roof like smoke through a chimney." Anna stayed longer than she'd planned, letting her hands thaw by the Knutsen's fire, thinking about Mrs. Knutsen's words. The warmth goes up through the roof. On the ride home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow that had begun to accumulate on the prairie. Anna pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at her shanty in the distance. Ice crystals had formed on the roof shingles. They caught the fading light and sparkled, everywhere except one spot near the peak. That section was bare, the shingles dark with moisture instead of frost. Anna stared at it for a long moment, not understanding what she was seeing. Then she understood. The hay. She stored loose hay in the attic, nearly 2,000 pounds of it, intended for the cow and for twisted hay fuel when the wood ran out. She'd piled it in the corner nearest the peak because that's where the attic was tallest, where she didn't have to stoop. Heat rises. Mrs. Knutzen had said so. The warmth from her stove went up through the ceiling boards, into the attic, and out through the roof. Everywhere except where the hay blocked it. That one spot, the spot with no ice, was directly above the hay pile. The hay was holding the heat in. Anna climbed down from the wagon and walked around her shanty, studying the roof from every angle. The pattern was clear. Ice crystals everywhere except the spot above the hay. The rest of the roof was bleeding warmth. The hay was stopping it. She went inside and climbed the ladder into the attic. The space was cramped, the roof sloping down to meet the attic floor at the edges. Her hay pile sat in the corner, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, stacked about 2 feet high. She put her hand on the ceiling boards above the hay. They were warm. She put her hand on the bare ceiling boards at the far end of the attic. They were freezing. The hay was doing what sod did. It was trapping the heat. Anna sat in the cold attic, her breath making clouds in the lantern light, and let the idea take shape. Sod walls kept warmth because they were thick, 2 or 3 feet of earth that heat couldn't pass through. Her lumber walls were only an inch thick, full of gaps. But her ceiling was the biggest surface in the house, and it was losing heat constantly, all of it rising straight up and escaping through the roof. What if she covered the entire ceiling? What if she spread hay across every inch of the attic floor? The Knutsen's sod roof kept their house warm. Anna's hay could do the same thing. She climbed back down and told Britta and Maya what she was thinking. Britta didn't understand. Maya was already asleep. Anna stayed up half the night working through the logic. 12 inches of hay across the entire attic floor. 192 square feet. She had nearly 2,000 pounds of hay stored, more than enough. The hay was supposed to be feed for the cow, an emergency fuel for twisted sticks. If she spread it across the ceiling instead, she couldn't use it for either. But if it worked, if the hay held the heat the way sod did, then the 2 cords of wood she had might last through winter. She wouldn't need 8 cords. She wouldn't need coal. She'd need only enough fuel to warm a house that actually held its warmth. It was a gamble. If the hay didn't work, she'd have wasted her only fuel reserve on an experiment. She'd have nothing left to burn when the cold came. But if she did nothing, she was going to freeze anyway. Thorvaldson's arithmetic guaranteed it. Anna made her decision. In the morning, she began carrying hay up the ladder. Ingrid Halvorsen arrived 3 days later and found Anna covered in hay dust, her arms full of loose stalks, climbing the ladder into the attic for what must have been the 100th time. "What are you doing?" Ingrid asked, her voice sharp with confusion. Anna came back down, set her armload on the floor, and wiped sweat from her face despite the cold. "Packing the ceiling." "With hay?" "It holds the warmth, like sod." Ingrid stared at her, then climbed the ladder herself and looked into the attic. Anna had covered perhaps a quarter of the floor with loose hay, packing it down to about a foot thick. Ingrid came back down. Her face was unreadable. "Hay is fuel," she said. "You're taking fuel off the pile and putting it where you can't burn it." "I know." "If this doesn't work, you won't be able to get that hay back down fast enough. You'll freeze while you're shoveling." "I know." "What if it catches fire from the stovepipe?" Anna pointed upward. "I'm leaving 3 feet of bare boards around the pipe, nothing touching it." Ingrid shook her head slowly. "Thorvaldsen will say you've gone prairie mad." "Probably." "Anna." Ingrid's voice softened. "I've seen what the cold does to people who aren't prepared. I've seen children." She stopped. "You have 2 little girls. Come look at something." Anna led Ingrid to the attic hatch and pointed up. "Put your hand on the boards above the hay. Then put your hand on the bare boards at the other end." Ingrid hesitated, then climbed up and did as Anna asked. She stayed up there for a long moment, moving her hand back and forth between the 2 spots. When she came down, she didn't say anything. "You felt it," Anna said. "I felt a difference. Warm above the hay, cold above the bare boards. The hay is holding the heat in." Ingrid looked at her, then at the ceiling, then back at her. "You might be right," she said slowly. "Or you might be killing yourself and those girls with a foolish experiment." "I might be," Anna agreed. "But if I don't try something, I'm dead anyway. Thorvaldsen told me so himself." Ingrid left without giving her blessing, but she also didn't try to stop her. Word spread. In mid-November, Anna rode into Marion to buy lamp oil, the only thing she could still afford. As she stepped out of the general store, Elmer Dahl was waiting on the boardwalk. Dahl was 36 years old, American-born, owner of the quarter section to the east. He'd been trying to buy the Lindqvist claim since before Eric died. Now he leaned against the hitching post and watched Anna with an expression she'd come to recognize, amusement mixed with anticipation. "I hear you're putting your cow feed in your ceiling," he said. Anna didn't slow down. "Word travels fast." "New kind of crazy, stuffing hay between your rafters." Dahl pushed off from the post and fell into step beside her. "What happens when you run out of feed for the cow?" "That's my concern." "It's everyone's concern. A woman alone doing foolish things is a danger to herself and anyone who might have to rescue her." He stopped at her wagon and rested his hand on the side. "When you freeze out, I'll take the claim off your hands. $40. The offer still stands." Anna climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. $40? Dahl repeated. Fair price for land that'll kill whoever tries to work it alone. She drove away without answering. In the mirror of the shop window, she saw him watching her go, still smiling. At church the following Sunday, the minister pulled Anna aside after the service. Some in the congregation are worried about you, he said. They say you've been doing unusual things to your house. I'm keeping my family warm. Mrs. Lindqvist. The minister's voice carried the gentle condescension of a man who had never wondered where his next meal would come from. Perhaps you should seek the counsel of experienced men. Experiments are for people who can afford to fail. Anna looked at him. I can't afford to fail either, Reverend. That's why I'm trying something different. She collected her daughters and left before anyone else could offer advice. By Thanksgiving, Anna had covered 90% of the attic floor with hay, 14 inches deep, packed tight, leaving only the 3-foot circle around the stovepipe and the area directly above the hatch. 750 pounds of hay that could have been feed or fuel spread across the ceiling like a blanket she couldn't see. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the work. Her back ached constantly from climbing the ladder with heavy loads. She'd lost 5 pounds she couldn't spare because she was giving her food to Brita and Maya. At night, she coughed from the hay dust that had settled in her lungs. But the house was warmer. She couldn't measure it precisely. She had no thermometer, but she could feel the difference. The stove didn't have to work as hard. The fire could burn lower and still keep the chill at bay. She was using less wood than before. Less wood meant her 2.5 cords might last longer than she'd feared. It wasn't proof. Not yet. The real cold hadn't arrived. But it was hope, and hope was more than she'd had in September. December came hard. The temperature dropped below 0 on the first night of the month and barely climbed above it for the next 2 weeks. Wind screamed across the prairie, finding every gap in Anna's walls, every crack where the newspaper stuffing had failed. She hung quilts over the north wall, stuffed rags into spaces she'd missed, burned wood at a steady pace that terrified her when she looked at the shrinking pile. But the ceiling held. Above her head, the hay sat invisible and silent, doing exactly what she'd hoped. Heat rose from the stove, hit the ceiling boards, and stopped there instead of escaping into the attic. The warmth stayed inside. On December 7th, Britta developed a cough. Anna spent 3 sleepless nights keeping the fire high and the quilts piled deep, watching her daughter's breathing, praying the cough wouldn't turn into something worse. By the 10th, Britta was better. Anna was exhausted. On December 12th, the milk cow got sick. The animal stood in its corner of the shanty. Anna had started bringing it inside at night to preserve the warmth and refused to eat. Its breathing was labored. Its eyes were dull. Anna had a choice. Use precious fuel to keep the cow warm, or let it suffer outside where the cold might kill it. She chose to keep it inside. 3 more days of high fire, 3 more armloads of wood burned. The cow survived. Anna's woodpile dropped to 2 cords even. On December 15th, Ingrid Halvorsen returned. She came with a small sack of flour and a pound of salt pork, and she pretended it was payment for eggs Anna had given her in October. Both women knew the truth. Neither acknowledged it. Ingrid sat by the stove and looked around the shanty. Her eyes lingered on the ceiling, where hay showed through the cracks between the boards. "It's warmer in here than it should be," she said. "Yes. Warmer than my soddy some days." Anna said nothing. "I told you I thought you'd gone mad." Ingrid turned to face her. "I'm still not sure you haven't, but—" She shook her head. "There's something to this." Anna accepted the flour and the salt pork. In exchange, she gave Ingrid the 2 extra chickens she couldn't afford to feed through winter. The trade was technically fair. Technically. When Ingrid left, Anna stood in the doorway and watched her wagon disappear into the gray December light. The temperature was 12 below zero. Inside, Britta and Maya played on the floor beside the stove, warm enough to forget about the cold. 2 cords of wood, 8 weeks until spring. By Christmas, the ratio had improved. Anna's daily consumption had dropped from 90 pounds to 55. The hay ceiling was working better than she'd dared to hope. At the new rate, 2 cords might last until early March, if the winter stayed average. But Thorvaldsen's words echoed in her memory. Wait until a real blow, 40 below with wind. Then we'll see what hay does. The real test hadn't come yet. January of 1888 began with brutal cold. For the first 5 days of the month, the temperature never climbed above 20 below zero. Anna burned wood constantly, fed the stove every 2 hours through the night, and watched her breath freeze on the quilts she'd hung over the walls. Inside, the temperature hovered around 45 degrees, cold but survivable. Outside, the cold killed 3 of Thorvaldsen's cattle. Then, on January 6th, something changed. The wind died. The sky cleared, and the temperature began to climb. By January 8th, it was in the 20s. By January 10th, it had reached the 30s. On January 11th, Anna stepped outside into air that felt almost mild, 40 degrees, the warmest since November. She let Britta and Maya play outside for the first time in a month. She did laundry that would actually dry. She milked the cow without her fingers going numb. The stove sat cold most of the day because the sunshine did the heating. It felt like a gift. But Anna noticed something that made her uneasy. The animals were restless. The cow wouldn't settle. The chickens clustered together and wouldn't leave their coop. The dog that sometimes wandered over from the Thorvaldsen claim stood at the edge of the property and howled at nothing. That night, the barometric pressure dropped so fast Anna could feel it in her ears. A pressure change, like climbing a hill too quickly. The sunset was a strange color, green at the edges. She brought extra wood inside before bed. She didn't know why. Just a feeling. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, Anna woke to sunshine and 40-degree warmth. By afternoon, she would face the deadliest cold in Dakota Territory history. The sky changed first. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Anna looked up from the mending she'd brought outside to enjoy the warm air and saw something wrong on the northwestern horizon. The blue had turned greenish-black, a bruise spreading across the sky. The color was unlike anything she'd seen in 5 years on the prairie. Then she heard it, a low rumble, continuous, like thunder that wouldn't stop. But there was no lightning, just the sound growing louder. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in the time it took her to stand up. "Britta! Maya!" Anna's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Inside, now!" The girls were playing near the woodpile, building shapes in the melting snow. They looked up at her tone, confused by the urgency. The day had been so pleasant. "Now!" Britta grabbed Maya's hand and ran. Anna scooped up her mending and followed, glancing back at the horizon. The black wall was closer now, moving faster than any storm she'd ever seen. The rumble had become a roar. She got the girls through the door and turned to pull it shut behind her. The wind hit before she could close it. The force slammed the door against the frame so hard the hinges screamed. Anna braced her shoulder against the wood and pushed with everything she had. The temperature was falling. She could feel it dropping degree by degree, the warmth bleeding out of the air like blood from a wound. Snow exploded past the gap, filling her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She got the door closed. She dropped the bar across it. Outside, the world disappeared. The visibility went from miles to feet to nothing in the span of a minute. The wind shrieked at 60 miles per hour, driving snow so fine and hard It sounded like sand against the walls. Anna couldn't see the woodpile. She couldn't see the ground. She could barely see her hand in front of her face through the window. She had brought in extra wood the night before. Just a feeling, she'd told herself. Now that feeling might save their lives, because anyone who went outside in this would be dead before they'd walk 10 steps. Mama? Britta's voice was small, frightened. What's happening? Anna didn't answer immediately. She was watching the thermometer nailed to the wall by the door. Eric's thermometer, the one luxury he'd insisted on bringing from Sweden. The mercury was dropping visibly, sliding down the glass tube as she watched. 40 degrees when the storm hit. 35 5 minutes later. 30 by the time Anna got the stove burning hot. The children's blizzard had arrived. By 3 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped to 15 degrees. Inside, the stove roared. Anna fed it steadily, not with the careful rationing she'd practiced all winter, but with the desperate urgency of someone racing a clock she couldn't see. The fire consumed wood, and the wood became heat, and the heat rose toward the ceiling. Where the hay caught it and held it, Anna put her hand against the ceiling boards. Warm, not hot, but warm. The hay above was doing exactly what she'd prayed it would do. The heat wasn't escaping through the roof. It was staying inside, pooling beneath her palm like something solid. It's working, she whispered. She didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until Britta looked up. What's working, Mama? The hay. It's keeping us warm. Outside, the wind screamed louder. By 4 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped below 10 degrees. The tar paper on the north wall, the side facing the wind, began to tear. Anna heard it flapping, a sharp, rhythmic slapping that meant cold air was pouring through the exposed lumber cracks. She grabbed quilts from the bed and hung them over the north wall, pinning them to the boards with nails she'd saved from Eric's toolbox. The quilts billowed inward with each gust, then pressed flat against the wall as the wind shifted. Cold leaked around the edges. More quilts. Every blanket she owned except the ones the girls needed. She covered the north wall completely, creating a fabric barrier between her family and the wind. It helped. Not enough, but some. At 4:30, Maya began to cry. Anna turned from the wall and found her younger daughter huddled on the bed, shivering despite the fire's heat. She crossed the room and put her hand on Maya's forehead. The skin was burning hot. No, Anna breathed. No, no, no. Maya's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Her cheeks were flushed red, but her hands were cold. She was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Fever. The child had a fever. On the coldest night of the year, in a blizzard that had trapped them inside with no hope of help, her 4-year-old daughter was burning up. Anna's mind raced through options and found none. She couldn't go for help. The visibility was 0. The wind was 60 miles per hour, and she'd be dead within yards of the door. She couldn't move Maya closer to the stove. Too close, and the child might be burned. And besides, fever patients needed to be kept warm, not hot. She couldn't reduce the fire to conserve wood, because a sick child in a cold house would die faster than a sick child in a warm one. She needed to keep the temperature high. Higher than normal, high enough to break the fever, which meant burning more wood than she'd planned. Anna looked at her wood pile. 2 cords, minus what she'd already burned today. Maybe 1 3/4 remaining. At normal consumption, enough for 5 weeks. At the rate she'd need to burn it to keep Maya warm through this fever and this storm, she didn't finish the calculation. She didn't want to know the answer. Britta. Anna kept her voice steady. I need you to help me. Her 6-year-old looked up, pale but alert. I need you to feed the stove when I tell you. Small pieces like this. Anna demonstrated, breaking a log into smaller sections. Not too much at once, just enough to keep it burning steady. Can you do that? Britta nodded. Good girl. Anna turned back to Maya, wrapping her in every blanket she could find, piling quilts on top of quilts until the child was barely visible beneath the layers. Maya's breathing was shallow, rapid. The fever was climbing. Outside, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees, then 0, then below. The longest night of Anna Lindqvist's life unfolded in 15-minute intervals. At 5 o'clock, she fed the stove. The temperature inside held at 52 degrees, despite the cold pouring through the gaps in the walls. Maya's fever hadn't broken. At 5:15, she fed the stove again. The wind had found a new gap somewhere. She could hear the whistle, but couldn't locate the source. The temperature inside dropped to 50. At 5:30, she found the gap, a crack between 2 boards on the east wall hidden behind the table. She stuffed it with rags and pushed the table against it. The whistling stopped. The temperature stabilized. At 6 o'clock, the temperature outside dropped to 5 below 0. Inside, 49 degrees. Maya took a sip of water but refused food. Her forehead was still burning. At 6:15, Anna realized she'd miscounted her wood. She had less than she'd thought, maybe 1.5 cords, not 1 3/4. The storm showed no signs of stopping. At 6:30, she fed the stove. The girls were both awake, huddled on the bed, Britta holding Maya's hand. The wind screamed. The walls creaked. The quilts on the north wall had frozen to the lumber, the moisture in the fabric turning to ice, which Anna realized was actually helping. Ice was a barrier too. At 7 o'clock, Maya's fever finally broke. Anna felt it the moment it happened. The child's skin went from burning to merely warm. The shivering eased. The tension in her small body released. Maya opened her eyes and looked at her mother with something like recognition. "Mama," she said, "I'm thirsty." Anna gave her water, then more water, then a small piece of bread that Maya ate slowly, chewing as if she'd forgotten how. "Is the storm over?" Britta asked. Anna looked at the window. Snow still drove horizontally past the glass, so thick she couldn't see the darkness beyond. The wind still howled. Not yet. At 8 o'clock, the temperature outside dropped to 11 below 0. Inside, the temperature held at 48 degrees. The hay ceiling was working, the stove was working, the frozen quilts were working. They were going to survive the night. Maybe. The darkest hours came between midnight and dawn. By midnight, the temperature outside had fallen to 30 below 0. Anna had never experienced cold, this profound cold that seemed to have weight, that pressed against the walls like something trying to get in. The wind had dropped slightly from 60 miles per hour to perhaps 40, but the temperature kept falling. Inside, the shanty held at 44 degrees. 44 degrees was cold, cold enough to see your breath. Cold enough that water left in a cup would form ice on top by morning. But it was not cold enough to kill, not if you had blankets, not if you kept moving, not if the stove kept burning. Anna fed the stove every 15 minutes now, small amounts to maintain a steady burn without consuming fuel too fast. She'd learned the rhythm over the winter, and now that knowledge was keeping them alive. Too much wood at once, and the fire would flare hot, then die to embers. Too little, and the flames would gutter out. At 2 o'clock, she ran out of split wood. The pile by the stove, the logs she'd brought in the night before, the ones that fit the firebox, was gone. What remained outside in the main pile was larger pieces that needed splitting, and she couldn't go outside to get them. Anna looked around the shanty. The chairs. Eric had built them from cottonwood scraps, simple 3-legged stools that served well enough. She picked up one, studied its construction, and broke it apart along the joints. The wood was dry, well seasoned from 4 years of use. It would burn hot. She fed the chair to the stove piece by piece. At 2:30, she broke apart a wooden crate that had held the last of their flour. At 3, she considered the bed frame but decided against it. They needed somewhere to sleep when this was over. If this was ever over. At 3:30, she found herself staring at the ceiling. The hay was up there. Nearly 750 pounds of it, spread across every inch of the attic floor except the space around the stovepipe. It was keeping them warm by trapping heat, but it was also fuel. Twisted hay burned fast, but it burned. If she climbed up there and started pulling it down. Number. If she removed the hay, she'd lose the insulation. The heat would start escaping through the roof again. She'd have to burn more wood to compensate, and she didn't have more wood. The hay was worth more as insulation than as fuel. The math had reversed. The calculation that had seemed so risky in November, using hay for insulation instead of saving it to burn, had become the only calculation that worked. The hay was keeping them alive by not burning. Anna almost laughed. Almost. At 4 o'clock, the wind picked up again. At 4:30, it peaked, a sustained howl that made the walls shake and drove snow through gaps Anna hadn't known existed. The temperature inside dropped to 42 degrees. 42 degrees was the edge. Any colder and survival became uncertain. Any colder and Maya's fever might return. Any colder and the water in the bucket by the stove would freeze solid. Anna fed the stove everything she could find. Scrap lumber, the broken chair legs, a wooden spoon that had cracked last winter. She kept the fire burning, kept the heat rising, kept the hay pressing down above them like a hand holding warmth in place. At 5 o'clock, the wind began to ease. At 5:30, Anna looked out the window and saw, for the first time in 14 hours, the faintest lightning on the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. At 6 o'clock, she stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, 42 degrees below zero, the coldest temperature ever recorded in Turner County. The wind had dropped to perhaps 10 miles per hour, barely a breeze by Dakota standards, but the air itself was lethal. She could feel moisture freezing in her nostrils with every breath. Snow had drifted against the north wall of the shanty, piling 6 feet high where the wind had driven it. The woodpile was buried. The path to the necessary was gone. The world was white and silent and impossibly cold. But Anna was alive. Britta was alive. Maya was alive. The hay had held. 3 days later, Gunnar Thorvaldsen limped into Anna's yard. His right hand was wrapped in bloody bandages. His face was drawn, aged 10 years since she'd last seen him. He walked like a man who had been broken and poorly reassembled. Anna met him at the door. The temperature had risen to merely 20 below, warm enough to step outside for a few minutes at a time, warm enough to survey the damage. "Thorvaldsen," she said. "Your hand?" "Frostbite." His voice was flat. "I went to check the cattle on the 13th, after the wind dropped. Got turned around in what was left of the snow. Lost the feeling in my fingers before I found the barn." He held up the bandaged hand. "They took 3 of them this morning. The doctor and Marion." "I'm sorry." Thorvaldsen grunted. He wasn't here for sympathy. His eyes moved past her, scanning the shanty, taking in the quilt still frozen to the north wall, the snow piled against the sides, the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "The girls?" "Inside. Warm. Maya had a fever, but it broke." Thorvaldsen stood in the frozen yard, a man who had survived 11 Dakota winters, and stared at the 12 by 16-foot frame shanty that should have been a coffin. "That building can't hold heat," he said. "I've seen frame houses like that. People die in them every winter. The cold comes through the walls, through the roof. He stopped. His eyes had found the ceiling visible through the open door. What is that? Between the rafters? Hay. Hay. I packed the attic with hay, nearly 800 pounds of it. It holds the warmth in like sod does. Thorvaldsen was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked past her into the shanty. Anna followed. She watched him stand in the center of the room, looking up at the ceiling where hay showed through every crack between the boards. He put his remaining good hand against the ceiling, held it there. "It's warm," he said. "The heat rises and gets trapped. It can't escape through the roof." Thorvaldsen turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in his eyes, something that might have been respect or disbelief or both. "I told you a widow couldn't survive a Dakota winter," he said. "I told you you'd freeze in this shanty." "You did." "I was wrong." The words came hard, like stones pulled from deep earth. "About the method, anyway. I was wrong." He didn't apologize. Anna didn't expect him to. He'd lost 3 fingers. She'd lost nothing but sleep. The winter had punished them both, just differently. "Show me," Thorvaldsen said. "Show me exactly what you did." Anna showed him. She showed him the hay in the attic, the depth of it, the way she'd left clearance around the stovepipe. She explained about the ice on the roof, about Mrs. Knutson's words, about the warm spot she'd discovered above the original hay pile. She showed him the frozen quilts on the north wall, the rags stuffed into the cracks, all the small desperate measures that had added up to survival. Thorvaldsen listened without interrupting. When she was done, he nodded once. "I'll tell the others," he said. The Bergstrom family lost their grandmother. The Hendricksons nearly lost their whole household, frame house, not enough wood. If they'd known about this... He shook his head. "I'll tell them." He left without saying goodbye. Anna watched him limp back toward his claim, his bandaged hand held against his chest, his breath making clouds in the 20 below air. She wondered how many people had died in frame houses across Dakota Territory, while she and her daughters stayed warm beneath a ceiling packed with hay. She wondered if any of them might have lived, if they'd known. They came to her in the days that followed. Ingrid Halvorsen came first, the day after Thorvaldsen's visit. She'd survived the blizzard in her sod house without trouble. Sod held heat the way God intended, she said, but she'd burned nearly all her firewood doing it. Next winter, she'd be short. "Show me," she said. "Show me what you did." Anna showed her. Ingrid climbed into the attic and put her hands on the hay, on the ceiling boards beneath it, on the walls where the heat was so different from what she expected. "I thought you'd lost your mind," Ingrid said when she came back down. "I thought you were wasting good fuel on a fool's experiment." "I know. I was wrong. You were right." Ingrid met her eyes. "I'm putting hay in my attic before next winter. Olaf will think I've gone mad too. But I don't care. I felt the difference." The Knutson family sent their eldest son, a boy of 16 named Peter, to ask questions on behalf of relatives who lived in frame houses farther west. Anna explained the principle: heat rises, hay blocks it, the roof stops bleeding warmth, and Peter wrote it all down in a notebook he'd brought. "My uncle's family nearly froze," he said. "Their fire went out at midnight. They burned their furniture, their door, everything they could reach. When the storm ended, they had nothing left." "Did they survive?" "Barely. The children have frostbite on their feet. They might lose toes." Anna closed her eyes. "Tell your uncle about the hay. Tell everyone you can." A young widow named Christina Borg walked 3 miles through the snow to find Anna's claim. Christina had arrived from Minnesota just 2 months before the blizzard. She had a frame house, a baby, a husband who died of influenza in December, and no idea how she was going to survive the rest of the winter. "I heard you found a way," Christina said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard you kept your family warm with nothing but hay." Anna brought her inside, gave her coffee, and explained everything. By the end of January, 4 households in Swan Lake Township had added hay to their attics. By mid-February, the number had doubled. Word spread through the Swedish and Norwegian communities, passed along in church after services, discussed at the general store in Marion, mentioned in letters sent to relatives in other counties. No one called it insulation. They didn't have a word for it. They called it Anna's hay ceiling, or packing the roof, or simply what the Lindqvist widow did. It didn't matter what they called it. What mattered was that it worked. Anna showed everyone who asked. She never charged, never asked for credit, never claimed any special knowledge. She just showed them the attic, explained what she'd observed, and let them draw their own conclusions. Most of them reached the same conclusion. Hay held warmth. A frame house with hay in the attic burned less fuel. Less fuel meant more survivors. It was that simple, and that important. Elmer Dahl never came to ask. He never acknowledged Anna's survival, never visited her claim, never mentioned the hay ceiling that had kept her alive through the worst blizzard in Dakota history. When Anna saw him in Marion in late February, he looked past her as if she didn't exist. But the offer to buy her claim stopped. The predictions of her failure stopped. The smug certainty that a widow couldn't hold land alone, that stopped too. And sometime in March, a neighbor mentioned to Anna that they'd seen Dahl climbing into his own attic with armloads of hay. He'd told no one what he was doing. He'd asked no one for advice. But he'd done it. That was the validation Anna hadn't known she needed. Thorvaldsen's admission had been grudging but honest, the acknowledgement of a man who respected facts more than pride. Ingrid's conversion had been wholehearted. The recognition of a friend who doubted but could admit her doubt had been wrong. But Dahl had wanted her to fail. He'd wagered money and patience on her failure. He'd stood on the boardwalk in Marion and told her she was crazy, told her she was dangerous, told her he'd buy her claim when she froze out. And now he was packing his own attic with hay, in secret, because he couldn't deny what worked. That was victory. Anna never mentioned it to him. She didn't need to. The hay spoke for itself. By the end of the winter of 1888, at least a dozen homesteads in Turner County had added hay, straw, or sod to their attic spaces. Anna showed each visitor her ceiling without charge or condition. She didn't understand the science. The concept of thermal resistance wouldn't be measured and named for another 80 years, but she understood the result. Heat that rose toward the roof got trapped by the hay and stayed inside. Houses stayed warmer. Fuel lasted longer. Families survived. The method spread through the Swedish, Norwegian, and German-Russian communities along the lines of language and kinship. People trusted information from their own, especially information that had been tested in the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The Knutsens told their relatives. The Halversons told their church. The whispered knowledge traveled faster than any newspaper could carry it. No one gave Anna credit. No one needed to. The hay was the proof, and the hay was in their attics now, holding warmth against the cold. That was enough. Anna Lindqvist proved up her claim in 1892, receiving full title to 160 acres of Turner County land. She never remarried. Offers came, widowers looking for someone to cook and clean, young men who thought a proven claim was worth courting for, but Anna turned them all away. She'd buried one husband in Dakota soil. She had no interest in risking another. Britta and Maya grew up on the homestead. They attended the one-room school in Marion, learned English faster than their mother ever would, and eventually married local boys and started families of their own. The shanty where they'd nearly frozen became, over the years, a proper farmhouse, additions built, siding installed, a real barn constructed where Eric had always planned to put one. The hay stayed in the attic. Anna added to it every few years, replacing what had settled or decayed, keeping the layer thick and even. She never forgot the lesson of January 1888. Heat rises, and hay holds it down. In 1903, at the age of 44, Anna sold the farm to Britta's husband and moved to Sioux Falls to be closer to her grandchildren. She lived there for 14 more years, a small, quiet woman who spoke English with a Swedish accent and rarely talked about the homesteading years. She died in 1917, aged 58, and was buried beside Eric in the Marian Lutheran Cemetery. The gravestone listed only her name and dates. It said nothing about hay or blizzards or the winter she kept 2 children alive in a house that everyone said couldn't hold heat. But old-timers in Turner County remembered. On January 12, 1888, the temperature in Turner County dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. By midnight, it reached 42 degrees below zero. Wind screamed at 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to nothing. The children's blizzard killed between 200 and 500 people across the northern plains. The exact number was never known, because the bodies of some victims weren't found until spring. Gunnar Thorvaldsen had told Anna Lindqvist plainly, "A widow can't cut timber, can't haul coal, can't keep a fire through a 3-day blow. You'll freeze in that shanty, and those girls will freeze with you." He was right about the timber. He was right about the coal. He was right that she couldn't keep a fire burning without enough fuel to feed it. But he was wrong about the freezing. Anna Lindqvist didn't cut timber. She didn't haul coal. She stuffed her ceiling with hay and kept her fire burning through the worst night in Dakota history with 2 cords of scrounged deadfall and a wooden chair she'd broken apart for kindling. When the blizzard ended, her daughters were alive. Years later, old-timers in Turner County still remembered walking into Anna's shanty that January and feeling the warmth held above their heads. Heat that should have escaped. Heat trapped by 600 pounds of hay that a Swedish widow had dragged up a ladder, armload by armload, because she had no other choice. The hay was still there when she moved away in 1903. It had kept 3 people alive for 15 winters.